Hello everyone and welcome to my session. My name is Brent Gees and I'm going to talk a little bit more about how to get started with writing tests for contrib. So first of all, thanks to our sponsors, Diamond sponsor Acquia, Platinum sponsors Wunder and Platform.sh, Gold sponsors Commerce Guys, 1x Internet, Bloom ID, Everest, Nouveau, Thunder and MSE Labs. The slides for this presentation will be available at, actually they are already available at bit.ly Lisbon testing, and during the presentation I'm also going to use a module. That one is available at bit.ly Lisbon testing module. So if you want to follow along with the module or the slides, you can visit those URLs. So who am I? My name is Brent. I'm a developer / architect at Drupal in a company based in Ghent. I've been working with Drupal for 3.5 years, and those 3.5 years are all at Drupal. You can find me on Twitter and Drupal.org with a username Brent Gees. As you can see, that's a picture of me working in my natural habitat. This is my team, and that's me. Then a little bit, are there people here who have their own module? All right, a couple. And who here has written a test before? Also a couple, but most not really, so that will be good for the session. So what is testing? Software testing is a process used to identify the correctness, completeness, and quality of the developed computer software. It includes a set of activities conducted with the intent of finding errors in software so that it could be corrected before a product is released to the end user. That's a long sentence, but in more simple words, software testing is an activity to check that the software is defect-free. So, why I decided to give this session? Last year in September, I went to DrupalCon Vienna. There I participated in my first sprints. And those sprints were all writing tests. It was for a facets module, and I started with writing tests. I learned a lot because in my day-to-day job I'm not really working with tests a lot. So that's why I think it's a good way to get started with sprints is using tests. You'll learn things that you're not used to in your day-to-day job. Also, it's really helpful. Tests are something that most people don't like to do. So there are a lot of tests available, and they will be glad to see you're coming to help. Another advantage is that you don't have to know the complete module. Some modules are pretty big, and to get to know the module, it can take up to a day if it's a really big module. To just write a test, you just have to know the patch you're testing and maybe some other things in the test, so you can get started more quickly. So there's a difference in the session for your own modules. So if you wrote your own contrib modules, or if you want to help on other contrib modules. The advantage of all modules is that there are easiest tests available. So for example, if you just want to test if a certain page is still loading, it's an easy test and it's written in a couple of minutes. A disadvantage is that you'll have to set up everything yourself. With other modules, a lot of functions will have been created already. For example, to create a field or to create a page or create content, that will all have been set up already, most likely. A disadvantage is that the easy parts will be gone by then, most of the times, but there are most of the time still some easy available. I advise you, if you want to help other modules writing tests, find a maintainer or a co-maintainer from the module, talk to them, say, hey, I want to help you with writing tests for your module. Do you have some issues that need tests, preferably easy ones, and can you help me set those up? If you can't find a maintainer, you can always go to the Drupal.org issues queue and use the issue tag needs tests. At the moment there are 2,000 issues tagged with needs test in core, and 4,000 with needs test overall contrib and core. So you can say that there are enough issues available, and there will be one for your needs. Well, you should write tests. I don't know if someone else had this problem before, but on a project you fix, for example, the news page, and a month later the client says, hey, contact page is broken. And it turns out it was because of your change on the other page, which when you would have written tests, you'll find out those issues a lot quicker, and it will save time during development. Some non-website examples. In 1994, there was a software bug with an Airbus, and it crashed, and there were 264 people who died there. If they would have written better or more tests for that, maybe they would have discovered the software bug and it wouldn't have happened. Another example is a failure of a software launch, causing a loss of $1.2 billion. Of course, those issues are a little bit far from websites, but if you have your own module that is used by 100,000 or even more people, you have a kind of responsibility. If you have your module and someone creates an issue, someone else creates a patch, you think the patch is okay, you apply the patch, turns out after a week or two it wasn't okay, it breaks some things, but already 50 people updated their website. With your module, you've broken 50 websites. If you have tests, you'll discover it before releasing your new update, and those 50 sites will not have broken. So, types of testing. First, manual testing. That's the type of testing everyone should already know. And then there are a couple of automated tests. I'm going to cover three basic automated tests. There are a lot more available, but for this session we're going to keep it to the basics. So, manual testing. I hope everyone here has already done a manual test, because it can be done by a developer, a dedicated tester, can be done by the client, and or the project manager. It's the most primitive type of all testings, and it's most of the time used for short-term projects that aren't shared for multiple sites. A disadvantage is that you forget your use cases easy. For example, in the beginning of the project you test for 5 different users. Near the end of the project you just test for 2 users, and turns out after a week the 3 other users fail for some random reason. An advantage is that it doesn't require a lot of time. You can just go to websites, test the things you changed, and you're done. You don't have to write any code. But it can become very boring if you have to execute the same test multiple times. It can be done just in a browser, just surfing to websites, checking if everything works like you expected. It can also be done in code with Exibug, vardump, DSM, DPM, Kint, whatever you like to use. But it can also be done by reading code. For example, a colleague wrote a function to do something. You read over the function and test if it matches your expectations. That's also testing, because you test if the function does what it's expected to do. If you want to help on those, you can also go to the Drupal.org issue page and just search for needs review. I think at the moment there are around 3,000 issues in Drupal core who needs review, and 37,000 issues in general that needs review. Even if you don't like to write code, but you want to help the Drupal community, they'll be very glad to help, because that's a status where most of the issues get stuck for a while. So then to the automated testing. The first type of automated testing is unit testing. It's the most basic type of testing and the most easy one. It tests on functions, methods, and classes, and it extends on the unit test case class. the advantages of unit testing. You can verify individual parts. You can test if a function does what it's supposed to do. You can also quickly find problems in the code. If a unit test fails, you directly know what function fails. It also has a really fast execution time, and it doesn't require a lot of system setup for the first test run. There are also some disadvantages. When you refactor your function, it could be that you have to refactor your test as well. And when your function has dependencies, you'll have to mock those dependencies, and that can get pretty complicated. You also don't have a guarantee that the whole system actually works. The function itself can work individually, but it could be that 5 different functions don't work well together. The folder structure of the example module is just a really easy module with the info and a module file, a class Lisbon, and then the test folder. In a test folder you have a source folder, and in there you'll most of the time split up the different tests. For example, I'm using unit test, so I created a unit folder. You can put it in another folder as well, but I advise you to keep the difference between the different type of tests by using unit as folder. And then the class Lisbon some test. So the function I'm using, it's just a class Lisbon with a variable total, a getter, a setter, and then a function to add an amount to the total. So a really basic function. Then the test class, as you can see, it uses the namespace Drupal Lisbon, so the name of the module, and then it uses the Drupal tests unit test case. So for the class, you extend from the unit test case, and I also use the variable Lisbon. Then we have a first function, the setup function. This function is run every time you execute unit tests. So in there you can set up the tests for your test. So in here I create a class from Lisbon. Then another function that is used, that is executed every time, is a tear down function. That one is executed at the end of the function. So in here I unset the variable Lisbon just to keep things clean. But then the test class itself, I first test setting the total. So I use assert equals with that. Assert equals checks if the first part matches the second part. So in the beginning it should be 0. So I check assert equals 0 with get total. Then I try to set the total to 366. And then I check if the assert is now 266. So normally this should work. I also test the get. So I first set the total to 366. And then I use another function, assert not equals. Assert not equals is the difference from assert equals. So it will check if the first part is different from the second part. Then lastly I will check the add to total function. So I'll first set the total to 200 and then add 166 to the total and then check if it's 366. Now we have the function, the tests class, but we still have to test it on our local machine. If we push it to the Drupal contrib, it will test automatically, but we want to test it locally first. There are different methods. I'm going to cover one of them, the most used one, in my opinion. So for start, you need a default Drupal project. You can use git clone if you want. You can download it just from Drupal.org, but I advise you to use Composer. And with my Composer, I always add prefer source. That way you download the Git repositories, and it's easier to create a patch once your test is finished. If you're not working on core but a contrib module, you of course need that module. So again, compose require with preferred source. If you like to use git clone, feel free to do so. Then you go to the core folder in the web directory, and then lastly you have to copy the phpunit.xml.dist file to phpunit.xml. I'll show it in a minute, but after you have done that, you have to execute the test. So first you go to the root of your website. For me it's the web folder. And in there you'll execute the PHP unit from the vendor folder at -c core. -c core is used to specify where the PHP unit.xml file is located on your website. And then lastly, you choose what folder you want to test. You can leave it empty, and then it will test the complete core and all modules. But for the unit testing, it will take, actually for all the testing, it will take quite a while before those tests are executed. So I advise you to only specify the module you're using. If you want to test one specific test, you can also add a filter where you add the name of your test. So that way it will go a lot quicker. So let me show that. So as you can see in the core folder, you have the phpunit.xml.dist file. As you can see, I already copied the phpunit.xml. And for the first type of tests, the unit testing, that's enough. So after you've done that, you go to the terminal. So as you can see, I'm in the web folder. So first I'm going to forget the -c core. So you'll see what error you will get, and hopefully if you get the same error, you'll remember what to do. So we go to the vendor folder, PHP unit, modules, custom. So as you can see, you get an error. The class browser test base is not found. Why is that? In the phpunit.xml file, there's a part that defines where the unit tests suites are located. So we need those to execute. So looks like it's not working yet. To get it to work, there are two options. The first option is to add the -c core. With that, you tell where the phpunit.xml file is located. Oh. I was testing the complete module, that's why it took a little bit longer. So, as you can see, it's 254 milliseconds, so a unit test is pretty quick. So, I solved the issue by adding -c core. Another option is to go into the core folder. A disadvantage then is that you have to go up a folder more to execute your tests. But you don't have to specify the -c core anymore. Because you're in the directory, because you're already in the directory where the phpunit.xml is defined. But for now, I'll go back to the -c core. So the second type of testing, kernel testing. Kernel tests are integration tests that test on components. In there you can install modules. And it actually is a minimal Drupal installation. You have full API access, but you don't have HTTP access. Most of the time it extends from the kernel test base or the entity kernel test base. The advantages of kernel testing is that you can verify that components actually work together. So you can verify that 4 or 5 functions work together. It's a little bit easy to locate bugs. Sometimes it can be hard, but most of the time it's pretty easy. A disadvantage is that it has a slower execution time. It's still faster than functional, You'll notice it when I demo it, but it's slower than a unit test. It requires a little bit more of a system setup, and another disadvantage is that you have no guarantee that the end user features actually work. So for the folder structure of my demo module, the info in that module stayed the same. We added the config folder where we had an install file. In there we'll set a default value, also a scheme file, and in the source map we added a form. It's a basic form where we save one text field, and the text field has a default value, set it in the settings.yml. In the test folder, we now have the folder kernel. Again, you can add it to every test you want, but I advise you to use unit or kernel folder for structuring your test folder. And then there we have the Lisbon config test file. So first, the config form file. It's just a basic form. As you can see, it saves one text field, and in the submit it's added to the config. The settings.yml, as you can see, I added the default value of dev dates is awesome, and then a scheme file for the config form. Then to the more interesting part, the test file itself. As you can see, the namespace is again Drupal Lisbon. It uses the kernel test base now, and the class also extends from the kernel test base. I'm going to add a variable for the user, so test user, and there's also a variable modules. In there you'll define the modules that will be used during your test. So for example, I'm using the system module, the user module, and of course the Lisbon module. In here you also have a setup folder. So what I'm going to do here is install the config from the Lisbon module. Normally when you install a module, this will be done automatically, but because it's a minimal installation, you'll have to install the config here to make sure that is installed. So then to the tests in there. First we're going to test the default config. So we load the config, then we get Lisbon name config, and we check if the default config of dev days is awesome is correct. Then we're going to test to change the config. So first we're going to execute the same test as the default config. Then we try to change it, and then we check if the change came true. So as you can see, this uses a database, but it doesn't require any HTTP access. It just encodes directly with the database. So to set it up, it's a little bit more work than a unit test, but still doable. For the first time, if you haven't done it already, install a Drupal installation. So again, with Composer or git clone, whatever you prefer. Require the module or git clone the module. Again, copy the phpunit.xml file. The setting up is only for the first time. Once your setup is complete, you can just continue next week, next month, next year, and it will all be still working if you didn't change the files. So until this point, it's the same for unit testing, but there's one thing we have to change. In the phpunit.xml file, there's a place for a simple test database. So you'll have to create a database for testing, and you have to fill it in here. So for me, I use MySQL. My username and password locally are root. It's on my local host, and the folder name is, the database name is Lisbon testing. So in the phpunit.xml file, you'll see here that I've set that correctly. Then to test, it's exactly the same as unit test. Go to the web folder again, then vendor bin phpunit -c core, or if you're in the core folder, it's not needed, and then the module you want to test. You can also again add filter for the specific test. So to see a kernel test in action, so as you can see, I've added the kernel folder, so I'll test the kernel directory now. And as you can see, the test took 1.2 seconds, so a little bit slower than a unit test. Still pretty fast, but if you have 30 kernel tests on your module, it will take half a minute. So if you can use unit testing instead of kernel testing, try to use kernel testing. If I wouldn't have set the simple test database, I would have gotten an error. So as you can see, it gives an error. There is no database connection, so no tests can be run. You must provide a simple test database environment to run the tests. So if you get that error, it means you'll have to fill in the simple test database. So the last part of testing is functional testing. Functional testing has two bigger types, the browser test base and the JavaScript test base. In this session I'm going to cover the browser test base because it's the most basic of the two. The advantages of functional testing is that you can verify that the system works as experienced by the user. You can also verify that the system works when code is refactored. Another advantage is a personal preference, but I think functional testing are pretty cool. It also has some disadvantages. It's a very slow execution time. You'll see it in a minute that it gets really slow, especially when you have a lot of tests. It requires a little bit more system setup. It's still doable, and I'll cover how to set it up. It can be hard to locate the origin of bugs. It's also prone to random test fails. It's possible that your test just fails and you have no clue why. Try to rerun the test. It's possible that it will work then. I've had a problem with uploading a patch that it didn't work. Retested it and it worked. They can also be hard to change. So the folder structure. For the module itself, the only thing that has been added is a routing.yaml file. I created a path where the config form is accessible. And in the test folder, I have now the functional folder. Again, you can choose whatever folder you like, but I advise you to use unit, kernel, or functional to give a little bit of structure. In there I have two tests, the Lisbon config form test and the load test. The load test will just check if the front page loads. The Lisbon config form test will check if the config form works. So the routing.yaml, as you can see on admin/Lisbon, the config form is accessible. The config form is still exactly the same as by the kernel test. And then the config form test, as you can see, same namespace, Drupal Lisbon, and now it uses the browser test base. So the class extends from the browser test base. Again, a variable user and a variable edit form. The modules to enable, here I'm only using Lisbon, so I don't need to use system module anymore because that has already been installed by the browser test base. So again, the setup function. In this, I'm going to create a user with the rights to administer site configuration. So here I had the permission administer site configuration to access the path. So I need to make sure that the user can access that page. And then I'll log in with that user. Then the test itself. Actually, I'm going to test if I'm going to write a value in the text box on the config form, try to save it and check if it has changed. So edit form variable, that's just the path to the form, so admin/Lisbon. And then the form variable, that's an array with all the changes I want to make to the config form. In here there's only one text field I want to change, but you can add multiple changes in here. So edit Lisbon name. I'll show later in the session how I get to that key, and I'm going to change the value to Lisbon is awesome. Then I execute the Drupal post form function. In there you first specify the path. So we're going to change the form at admin/Lisbon. Then the changes for the form. I'm going to change the name to Lisbon is awesome. And then I'm going to execute the save. There's a button with value save. So that's the one that's going to be executed. Then I go to the admin/Lisbon page. Check if the page is still working. Maybe for some reason there was an unexpected error, or I made a typo and I get a 404 not found, or access denied, or unexpected error. With that, I check if the response code is 200, so if the site returns correctly. Then I load the config from the database, and then I will check if the field with name Lisbon name is the same as the one in the database. So to set this up is a little bit more work than a kernel test. The first part is still the same as a unit and a kernel test. So downloading the Drupal installation file, composer or git clone, then installing the module, again composer git clone, copying the phpunit.xml.dist file. Then you have already changed your database for the kernel test, but you'll also have to set up a base URL. Because the functional test uses HTTP, it will require an URL to serve to. So in here it's lisbontesting.local. To execute it, it's still the same as a kernel and a unit test. And I'm first going to show it without changing the phpunit.xml file, so you'll see what error you'll get. So still the same, but then functional. You'll see you must provide simple tests base URL. So we go to the file, and simple test base URL is lisbontesting.local. So if we execute the test now, as you can see, a functional test takes quite a while longer than a kernel test. So test succeeded, and the total execution time was 15 seconds. So functional tests are cool, and you can do the unit test and the kernel test in a functional test, but then your test will take quite a while before they are finished. But now I've executed all those tests, and I've written this test. How do you get the edit Lisbon name, and here the save value. The coolest part about browser testing is the debugging, in my opinion. You can record screenshots of all the steps the functional test makes. To do that, you have to change the phpunit.xml file again, and you have to fill in the browser test output URL. For me, I just use the site's default files folder of the project, but you can use any writable folder on your site. After you have done that, you add the following commands to your code. You add the printer, Drupal test listener, HTML output printer. So I'm going to demo that. Let me first copy this part. So first, the browser output directory. So for me, the files folder can be any folder. Then the same function, but adding the printer. So now it will execute the same function, but it will record screenshots of the pages it visits. So the functional test takes quite a while again. So as you can see, it recorded a couple of screenshots. I'll just show. So at first we did Drupal login, so it goes to the login page. Then the login succeeded. Go to the user page, then go to the configuration page. As you can see, the first one was dev days is awesome. That was the default form. Then try to change it. Lisbon is awesome. And how I found the values for the, where is it? For here is by inspecting this. So if you inspect it, go to the input file, you'll see the data Drupal selector is edit Lisbon name. So that's what I used for the form. And for the search field by name, I check the name, and that's Lisbon underscore name. So that's where that came from. And for the submit button, it has a value. It has here I just saved I just executed the save. So that's the screenshots of the functional tests. So to summarize those tests, if you want to test single functions, use unit tests. If you want to test module APIs without HTTP access, but with a database, use kernel tests. And if you want to test web interfaces, use functional tests. Finally, some tips and tricks. Start small. Start with the easy tasks. Just checking if a page exists or checking if a form exists. Once you are familiar with those, you'll get more and more. You'll execute the tests quicker and quicker, and you can get started and bigger and more difficult tests. Learn from others. A lot of tests are similar. The chances are big that your case you want to test has been tested on another module. Look at that module, look how they do it, and copy or change that code to your needs. Try to find a maintainer. Try to find someone who wants to help you writing tests for their module. They'll help you and guide you through it, and it will be a lot easier. For your own modules, try to create a roadmap. If your module is finished and you don't have tests, every time you think this could be an easy test, on your module page, create a roadmap, and every test you want to test, you write down there. And once you have time to write those tests, you go to the page and start writing those tests. Use Drupal console. You may have seen that I had the load test. That actually is a test that is created by Drupal console. So it just checks if the front page loads. It's a very simple test, but you'll have a base to start on, and it will be a lot, and it will be your first test for your module. So, anyone who has questions? Yeah, sure. Yeah, for me, actually, yeah. So the question was, if you're using MAMP like me, how do you set up the base URL for testing the site? So for me, I just created a regular project, like I do all of the time, added the URL to MAMP, and then use that URL for the testing. Is that an answer to your question, or? Oh. Oh, so sorry, the question was how to use it for Docker. I haven't used Docker a lot. Okay. Someone who has another question? Yeah, I thought it was the value safe, but actually I was wrong there. I thought it was safe configuration, but I think you can just use any string there. I thought it was like this, but apparently it was I was wrong on that one.
Could you maybe also show in Drupal.org on your module how to enable the testing, the automated testing, and what options you
Yeah,
have there?
sure.
That would be very useful if you have complicated modules.
So the question was if you can show how to enable testing on your module. So I'm just going to use one of my modules. And yeah, for me some tests failed, so that's not good. But the steps you have to do for your module is to create a dev branch. And when you have created a dev branch, you'll go to automated testing, and there you should be able to enable testing. I can't show it because testing is already enabled here, but normally there should be a button to enable tests.
But if you click on add test, I think that's the coolest part of Drupal.org. You have the testing of all the different kind of environments that you can select.
Yeah, in here you can select what PHP version and what Drupal versions you want to test. So for me it's just on PHP 5.5 and the development branch of Drupal. And you can also set up to run on every commit, on weekly base, on daily base. Yeah. You can add new tests there. Someone who has another question? Okay, then I thank you for listening, and if you have another question, feel free to reach out to me in the hallway or on Twitter, Brent Gees, or just on Drupal.org. Thanks.